points in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to explain why we just get the better factual memory of what happened in the Holocaust and why that itself is very important. But secondly, I'm going to explain why we just get better messaging along with that information and why that messaging is so important. Before that, a small piece of framing. This is specifically about Holocaust education. We don't care if for teenagers it's more important to see coming-of-age stories than just the Holocaust. We want what's good for the Holocaust education. So, why does it give us just better memory? We think that Etty simply had far more relevant things to say. Why do we think that? One, it is literally given in the info slide about what she went through, right? She went through a lot of things. She went to the camps. She worked as a nurse. She saw people come in and she saw people not come out. We think, however, that Anne Frank was, well, for better words, she was stuck. She did not go anywhere and she did not see anything really happen. So she doesn't have a lot to say about the world around her, only about what was inside her. Secondly, we think Etty was an adult. She knew how to separate what is important from what is less important. She knew how to tell us what should be remembered for generations, and she knew to omit the things that won't be relevant for the people who come after. Whereas Anne Frank was writing the diary for herself, and she was writing it from the perspective of the child that she was. What was important to her in that moment, and what was important to her in many ways, was not what's important to us so much time later. Why is that? Because, well, consider the daily lives of somebody living in a war zone. I'm sure most of you can. I think you'll find that most of the things that you do not have to do with the war. However, when we're talking about something like the Holocaust, that sort of flips on its head. However, that does not mean that you don't have a world inside you. What this essentially means is, while Anne Frank did have very much an interesting inner world, it was simply not relevant for the people who come after, and knowing that she had an inner world is not enough for what we want a Holocaust commemoration to be. Thirdly, we think that Etty simply had a better political understanding of what was going on. Not only was she, more involved in the sense that she was outside and saw things happening, she also had the perspective of an adult, understanding why the war was happening, who invaded whom, how they rose to power, etc., etc. From that means that she knew better to analyze what was happening, and therefore she could explain it to the future readers. Therefore, she could give us the relevant information that would then be relevant. Anne, however, as I said, was a child and probably had very little political understanding, which is why she didn't really write down the political happenings around her, even if she did have the information. Yes, opening.
As you stated correctly, this motion is about Holocaust education, not Holocaust research. Why is accuracy even important? What are you trying to achieve by Holocaust education?
When a child is learning what happened in the Holocaust, we want that child to know what happened in the Holocaust. Just hearing about one girl who was stuck in an attic and had really a miserable time there is not enough to understand the grander scale of the war. It does not explain the camps. It does not explain the persecution. It does not explain the invasion and the malnutrition and the abject cruelty that the prisoners were under. She was far away from the Nazis for the vast majority of the book, and there was very little that happens after they find her. She essentially simply dies. This does not reflect the reality of most people who lived then, and it is and as such is just simply less important for the future education. They need to know what happened. Research only exists to inform us, and so. Yes, so this information was just specifically far more relevant for children that should learn about the Holocaust. But note that it's not that she wrote more accurately. She also wrote more sort of grand principles. She had philosophy. She explained persecution and perseverance. She explained bravery and heroism, and importantly, love and pacifism, and what ought to be done, not just what is being done, not just what she feels, but what she has to say about the world. And we think this just is incredibly important, especially in Holocaust education. Why is that? Because we think simply remembering that there were victims and that they were human is not enough, because we need to draw conclusions. Saying they were here, they were people, they suffered, what a shame, is simply not enough. We need to understand why this happened and how we can prevent this from happening in the future. What conclusions should we draw? And we draw, and what Etty does in her book is several things. One, it teaches the optimism, the peace, and the anti-racism, especially note for people in modern times that do live in similar or dissimilar persecution, but need that hope, need that understanding, because Anne Frank's diary will not speak to them and will not educate them. But secondly, it teaches them to, it teaches the children to be that optimistic and peaceful. Secondly, we think that it teaches the children to be brave. Etty went as a nurse, risking her own life to the camp just to make sure that the rest of the people there were better. It teaches us that even in the darkest moments and even in the hardest time, we must strive to be the best people that we can be and to help one another. And that resorting to self-preservation alone in those times will not save all of us, but helping each other will save some of us and will help some of us. And this is the most important thing, because we can't just have them read about Anne Frank, and truly they will empathize with her. We will concede that, but they will also empathize with Etty. They will also see that she was just a woman. She was just a person who wanted to do as much good in a world that was really, really fucked up at the time. They will see that even though the Nazi war machine destroyed everything she cared about, she never gave up hope. She never gave up optimism. She still strived for a better world, and a better world did come. For those reasons, please propose.
2, 1. I think Oren forgot how it feels like to prepare for history exams, what we actually remembered after them, and how we studied for those type of exams, which is basically what education feels about as a student in the system. So in my speech, I will basically I will attack directly that, explain why we get better education and therefore later on better commemoration using Anne Frank and not Etty something. Okay, so when we try and teach children and later on teens, we need to do a couple of things. First, we need to make the content actually approachable. So it looks like talking about children, which feels close to me as a child. We need to talk about things and concepts I can grasp. Not like, let's try and be pacifist in the future and always strive to be a hero, which feels brave but distant, and you need to explain first to children what is pacifism and why she had to fight for that, and then explain all the horrors the Nazi did, which are less than, which is less age appropriate than just saying Anne Frank had to go for under those things, and then she died, and not talk about her death, because that is not children appropriate. And you need the content to be actually familiar, something that I already knew before, or else when I prepare for exams, I'm just going to be angry because I have more materials and more dates and more stuff that the people need to remember, and then I'm going to cram for the history exam, and then I'm going to forget that, because that was just dates and just information, and I had tons of that to know. Most of it, if you're not studying in Israel, is not about the Holocaust. So it's just a small chapter that you learn and then forget. Okay, why when studying about Anne Frank, it is different. Firstly, because she's a child, and because she wrote her thoughts as a child, it is inherently more children appropriate than talking about someone that had to sacrifice herself for her principles, and went and had to volunteer to go to camps, which most children don't know what actually went there. So you also need to explain that. Which means that I get to know who Anne Frank is and her name at a younger age. So I know her since I am 8 or 9 or 10, and then when I have a small page or two about her, and I get to read her book, and maybe I get to visit her house if I study nearby, then she is something I know and it's familiar, and I just need to remember her story. Secondly, she is not about Anne Frank is not a political text, which might sound like we're losing accuracy, but do know that most high schoolers get antagonized when we have to learn something that we don't actually need to know, and that is complicated more than that happened there and that happened there, and then it ended. Because it's more things to know, more things to remember, and it's usually not that relatable and kind of boring because it's politics, and we don't even really get involved in that in our own country in this time. So bringing a political text to high schools about someone we didn't know before, just to study for an exam about in a minor chapter, is a lot to do instead of just talking about Anne Frank at a younger age, which we already do and already happens. Even abroad, they do teach about her, they do let us read her diaries. Which means that we need to learn less new things, which makes her a familiar something that we can understand, we can grasp, and we can be horrified about what happened to her. Why is it so impactful on children? Firstly, because she is a child. I get to firsthand understand that when I go to punishment for an hour in my room, that sucks. And she was there for years. So when I hear that, I can understand, I can try and understand at least, how terrible that was. And when I fight with my siblings, and then we go our separate ways, I get that if I was stuck with my brother in the room after we had a fight, that would suck. The things that she went through are things that I cannot grasp, but I can try and understand. I can think I understand, and it makes me feel sorry for her. It makes me understand that what the Nazi did was terrible. It was awful, and it wasn't just killing people. This means, it also means that as a parent, I can see, wow, a child went through that. That is horrifying. That is terrible. Children should not go through that. And also, children are more relatable. We don't like people who kill children. Generally, bad thing. Okay, so why is it so important that we remember? Why is it so important that we remember this in this specific way? Firstly, because we have an obligation toward the 6 million Jews that died to remember it and to remember how terrible that was and how horrific it was. But also, we do have a couple of people who survived, Holocaust survivors, and organizations that support them and support the commemoration, who are still alive and are still active. And we need to raise awareness so they can keep going and keep commemorating all those things. We have an obligation, and we need to make sure that it works. And we need people all around the world to understand that what happened in the Holocaust happened only to Jews, but it was terrible and it was catastrophic and it was a horrible thing to do in global levels. It was a lot of people that died and a lot of children that went through what she went through. And when you can grasp that, we can understand and we can do better and try to make people understand and make it not happen again. For all those reasons, oppose.
I'm going to show one. I know, you had a survey about it. Sorry, that's the last joke. I'm going to do a very simple thing. I'm going to show why, one, we have significantly more relatability and exposure and understanding on our side, why all of Leary's analysis still stand, but also add more analysis on this. Secondly, I'm going to weigh why this is more important than anything that they want to argue, either on messaging or role models or accuracy, why the single most important thing we want in Holocaust commemoration is people to resonate, remember, and hear more about it. Before that, just one piece of external framing, and then I'll get to the point. All rebuttal will be integrated. Our analysis does not just apply to Israel. I don't know why they assumed it does. Maybe because Liri started her framing with a joke about how Oren hasn't been to school in a while, but if you look at her mechanisms, literally all of them apply to people all around the world. Let's get to the point. Second thing I want to say that already starts the point. Liri's analysis also doesn't exclusively apply to children. She used a lot the example of children because, well, she's a child, sorry. But if you think of her analysis, she says, one, most people, in general, don't talk complex political philosophy in their day-to-day jargon. It is remote and distant for most of them. Most people, even if they're not children right now, have been a child at some point in their life and can resonate with the experience and the lived experience and the trauma and the psychological fear of a child in that position. Most people have children of their own, and this is still relatable to them from that position. What if it would be my child? All of our analysis is more applicable to children, but still applies to adults as well. But let me add some more. One, why do we think, first, I just want to gut check. Anne Frank's diary is a global bestseller. Anne Frank's museum is overbooked. Tamara literally said it before the debate started, she couldn't get tickets. We know for a fact that a lot of people consume it, care about it, appreciate it. It is factually popular. Why is this true and why is this unique? One, because we think that our message is one that is much closer to home. It's something that much more people can say about. This could have been me, or this could have been my child. Why? Aside from all of the clear to understand, one, because it was coerced. Note that the info slide states that Etty's story was she volunteered to go to the ghettos to go as a nurse. Most people would never do this. She's a hero, sure. But most people say, okay, this could never be me. I admire her, good for her. I could never do this. Whereas when it is coerced, when it happens and drops on you out of nowhere, and you could have never expected this, like Anne Frank, which was afraid and she could never escape, this is when I feel, fuck, this could have been me. This could have been my child. There would be nothing that could have prevented it. She was defenseless against it. She couldn't do anything. Secondly, because she's much more human and close-like, because she tells a human story. She doesn't talk about history or politics, which is not just a lack of not as easy to understand, but it's just not what most people experience. Most people's day-to-day life is personal, is about their troubles with their friends, or love life, or loneliness, and this is something that's much more close to them and easier for them to resonate with. Secondly, we think that once you depict her as a hero, this actually makes her less relatable, because most people could never be heroes. Most people are much more identifying with the victim that they could have been than the hero that they could never be. Thirdly, we think that it is less politicized. And I'm sorry, Adi, you can't say that this is apolitical because, oh, don't kill people is apolitical, when the info slide literally states radical pacifism. I would say that radical pacifism is quite fucking political. So I think that this means that it is politically alienating to at least some of the readers. It means that some people who think maybe the real message of the Holocaust wasn't that we should aspire for peace, but maybe it was that the Jews were defenseless because they did not have their own military, are going to find this message alienating, will think she's naive, will think that she brought it on herself and she gave too much trust to the enemy, and we should learn the opposite message out of this. We think that therefore a message that is apolitical, that is just human, is much more resonant, it's much more bipartisan, it resonates with everyone. Fourthly, we think that people easily get desensitized on their side. Why? Because Etty's story is horror upon horror upon horror upon history. The fact that Anne Frank's story starts from a normal life of a girl before the Holocaust started, living her normal life, caring about her regular issues, never expecting the banality of evil to hit her out of nowhere, and suddenly her life collapses in front of her eyes, is precisely what creates the shock value. When I just read about death, and more death from beginning to end, there's no shock value. It feels like an information text. And like, you know, the single death is a tragedy, many deaths are a statistic. When I hear about a story which is much more, this is out of nowhere, this creates the shock value. Before I wait, closing, please, an extension.
Sure. What death do you care about more? My cousin's or Einstein's?
I think that the death I resonate with more passionately is your cousin's. I think maybe on practical reasons, if I need the utilitarian libertarian calculations I would care about Einstein. I don't think most people think this way, especially when they don't think of this consciously. They read a book and they are just resonating or not resonating subconsciously on purely emotional terms. Cool. Let's weigh why resonating is most important. First, I want to note that I think it is heavily ignored that we do have an obligation to those who died to commemorate them and remember them. This is, one, the only thing that is left from them. This is their only way to stay on living in some sense through our memories. And two, I would point that this is both more unique and more inherent than other values in this motion. Why? Unique because you can have role models in so many other things other than the Holocaust, like superheroes, as you said. You can have messages and politics and so many other contexts and mediums, whereas the commemoration of those specific people who died is much more unique. Secondly, inherent because you can't control the political messaging that you send. It will be up to the interpretation of whoever reads it, who might abuse it in every direction. This is why we see abuse of the Holocaust from left and from right. But you can control just how many people remember it. Aside from this, we think that this is simply logical prior to any message they want to send. Why? Because for a message to pass, you need to first be exposed to it. If more people read it, find it more interesting, recommend it to more people, say it influenced me, more people get exposed. Two, you need to understand it. If you don't understand it, you can't get any message. Three, you need to believe what you read and not say she was just crazy or politically biased and she brought it on herself. You need to believe that she's right about her perception. Four, you need to remember, not just understand, but remember it for long enough for this to have an impact. Five, you need to go on further because neither of these stories is historically accurate. Both are anecdotal, both are one person, neither gives the full picture. But what can give the full picture is if you care enough and get interested enough to either read more or watch more documentary movies or go to the museums or go to Yad Vashem and actually get more accurate depiction through this. Lastly, we think that you're likelier to see links with the real world and apply any message if it is resonating with you and you can see how it could happen to you. Happy to oppose.
This motion is about education. The reason that CG is going to win this debate is because we are going to prove to you in our extension why teenagers that then become adults are going to be educated better about the Holocaust, which will actually lead to impacts in the real world about how they look at policy, about how they're more likely or less likely to be part of oppression, take part of oppression in the future, and why this is actually the most important thing and actual impact in this debate. Before that, two small points of extraneous rebuttal to OO. The first point is like everything they say about children we think is just off clash. No one is teaching 13-year-olds about the Holocaust. People learn this when they're 17, when they're 18, before they go to Poland. Like everyone in the world is 16 to 18. We think that's where most of the debate is, and that's at least what we support on our side of the house. Like if you're teaching 13-year-olds about Anne Frank, you're teaching 16 and 17-year-olds about this young adult that is also similar to their age. We think that that's out of the debate. Second, in terms of what Hadar says about things being difficult to resonate with, notice that Anne Frank's story isn't easy to resonate with. Literally any story in the Holocaust is indescribable and pretty much impossible for us to imagine ourselves or our family in a similar situation because it is so tragic, because it is so horrific. Like, I don't think 13-year-old girls read Anne Frank's book and are like, oh, what happened if I would get my period in like some cabin locked away? Like, people can't imagine these stuff. This is hard to resonate on both sides of the house. What we're going to show you is not about resonation. We're going to show you why teaching it through our side of the house actually teaches more educational things and gets people more interested and gets people actually learning what takeaways we should be taking from the story of the Holocaust and how it impacts them in their day-to-day life. We think no one in the world can that didn't experience it can actually resonate with what happened because the things there are so horrific. So let's get into our case about less oppression in general. Look, the status quo, which is Anne Frank, is very popular because it's a touching story about a 13-year-old girl. She suffered, she wrote the diary pretty well. It's an easy read, it's a simple read, it's pretty much tragic, sad story, very simple. It's pretty much information of kids suffered in the Holocaust. This is sad, her childhood was very sad, and then she died of typhoid in the camps. It's very bad. This isn't enough nuance. What we teach you on our side, what we're going to show on our side of the house, is why when we teach through Etty, we get much more nuanced and much more interesting and things that actually make people think more over than just learning for tests about information or simple stories like Anne Frank. Why this gets us to think about what happened. So we think that it's likely that the way that the teachers are going to teach her story specifically is to focus on her pacifism, to focus on the morality of her decisions. The fact that she made a decision to sacrifice herself, and the statement that her life wasn't more important than anyone else in the camp. It's to talk about the Judenrat and people that the Jews that actually cooperated with the Nazis and why that's problematic. It's to tell your students, guys, do you think if you were there, would you cooperate with this? What type of person would you be? It's to talk with youth about the Hitler Youth and to tell them, do you guys think that if you were Germans, would you take part of this? How would your morality look like? How would you behave in this situation? This is way more interesting than just learning another tragic story. Like, everyone knows about the Holocaust that was very bad, and Anne Frank is just another tragic story. When we learn it from our side of the house, it actually opens up questions of debate, questions of discussion, questions of morality, question of what would you do if you were there? How are humans able to do this? Is this something that can happen in the future? Is this something that can happen today? Are similar things happening in the world today? We can tie it into like what's happening to the Uyghurs. We can tie it into things that the Russians are doing to Ukrainians, right? It's much, much more interesting. I think that it's also going to be taught well and also going to be received much better than the status quo. No. Next, we think that moreover than everything that I told you, specifically notice that Anne Frank is very much appropriate for young girls. I'm saying this about myself and other males that I know. It's very hard to connect to the story of Anne Frank because she's a 13-year-old girl that went through Girat Baglut Shel Banot in the Holocaust, which is something that so two reasons why it's different on comparative. So the first reason, she's literally a 13-year-old girl, it's hard to connect to that. But the second reason is the issue of bravery, right? Anne Frank basically hid out, survived, and then died. As opposed to this story about Edda, which is a story about someone that actually had morals, that actually stood her ground and said, I'm going to go to the death camps because I think that my life isn't worth more than other people's life, and that I think that that's the moral thing to do, and to stand up and to be a pacifist. We think that that's something that men can connect to much more because it tells a story of bravery. It tells a story of if you were there, you wouldn't join the Judenrat. You would sacrifice yourself in order to save other people. This is a message and a story that men can connect to much more. Why is this crucial? Because notice that the Holocaust and most of the genocides and bad things that happened and war were perpetrated mainly by men. Most SS Nazis were men. Most of the politicians were men, and this is extremely important. Sadly still, most of the people in politics, most of the combat soldiers everywhere in the world, most of the people that do war crimes today, the people this is actually relevant to are men. And on our side of the house, we're educating these people much, much better, which gives us a lot of impact. Before I get into the impact thing, I'll take Owen. Closing.
Is pacifism or anti-racism or just obeying orders a good way to deal with Nazis?
We think that we're also talking about pacifism and anti-war, but we're also highlighting the part where she sacrificed herself in order to save other people and that she didn't cooperate with the Nazis. We think that that's the main thing that our case talks about. Okay, so the impact thing here is simple. The first level is just creating better 17-year-olds, better children. We think less bullying. We think I'm more likely to just behave nicer to other people and to be a more mannered and more normal human being. But where does this get interesting? It gets interesting when these 17-year-olds then become adults and later in their life they're voting about policy, about foreign policy in Ukraine, about foreign policy in China, about military interventionism, about war crimes and patriotism and the fact that in America but people love soldiers there and a lot of war crimes aren't held accountable, right? We've seen this everywhere in the world. And at the end of the day, when we teach it through this way, it's actually much more likely that we're going to be able to educate people to actually learn from the Holocaust, to actually understand that similar things can happen today, that we have to have critical thinking, and we have to see where similar forms of oppression are happening in society. This is the biggest impact in the debate, because both sides talked about wishy-washy educational stuff. We actually gave you impacts of policy, foreign policy, and things that are going to happen. For all those reasons, please propose. 2, 1.
Why do fireflies die so fast? This question was in the grave of the fireflies. We believe the premise of this debate, the themes of the missing, that the message of anti-war and the message of peace already exist in many amount of dynamics. We believe we need to create a message that deliver to the people who are suffering out of it in the status quo, people who suffered the Holocaust, the Jews. First of all, we're going to rebut their point and explain why we believe the message, the universal message, is much more better on our side of the house when you don't have some kind of ideology who can be contribute in other ideas. Then, therefore, we'll explain why there is anti-Semitism in status quo, what are our roots, and how the message of Anna Frank combated easily, and what we want out of our house, that the next time people will see Jews on the street, the next time the person see someone call other kike, and we believe this is the most probable time when someone will tell you about this message. When someone in this classroom decide to call you a Žid, this is the most probable way that the message is going to be delivered, and this is why it needs to be the most humanistic, and we believe we just really win because we're going to give you the most proximate impact, because, as I said before, we have a lot of messages about peace in the status quo. But basically, let's listen to our case. They believe, okay, we need to give you a huge amount of message. You need to be more active, you need to be more protective, you need to be the ultimate pacifist and a person who prevent other people from suffering. We believe the problem with this message is just not resonates globally. There are some people who are more, for example, the more militaristic cultures will see this message as something weak and will just hate the person much more. They will see as someone who didn't protect other people, who should have been fight. On the opposing side, Anna Frank was a fucking child. She shouldn't have been fought. She shouldn't have been in this area at all. This is why the message is much more easier on our side when you're just a poor girl suffering. And this is basically dealing with your case. So let's go to our case. In the status quo, we see a huge amount of anti-Semitism. We believe they have some kind of several roots that people see from young age. First of all, we see huge amount of crimes that happening and committing war crimes and other things around in the area. Second thing, they have some kind of local anti-Semitism in this area. For example, like in Eastern Europe, they're basically saying time and time again and creating conspiracy theories how Jews still control the world. This still resonates. My grandmother still call me a Žid from time after time, even though I'm fucking her grandchild. That means people are actually have these things, and this is something that's happening and existing in the status quo. They see huge amount of people that are suffering. They see children from the underside of the Palestinians, the Arabs, who see those people are suffering. That means they're creating some kind of anger that they cannot really reach out and pull out, and this is basically going towards the people who are mostly resonates with Israelis. Those are the Jews. That means most of these people that Israel trying to protect, the way to actually attack them is via creating this idea. What we believe the message will happen in school. We believe this actually will happen when the first time when someone will call other children kike, when some kind of person will see that the people are trying to attack you and try to enforce this thing around. We believe when we are going to see the message of something idealistic and pacifistic, it's just much more harder to resonate with this message. She's a really brave, strong woman who actually fought and actually proved herself to some extent. It's much more harder to resonate me, as I said before in my rebuttal, because the message is much more harder to believe and less understandable towards me. Second thing, it just desynthesized me from the Jews, because one of the stereotypes about the Jews, about how they control the banks, how there are many bank laureates, that means they have some kind of idea that they are with their nose held up. On the comparative side, when you see Anna Frank, you see a poor child who didn't have a choice in her life, who I can really resonate with her, who I can really understand her, and I see basically one simple thing. First of all, she is a human being. In the status quo, one of the most troubling things about being Jew in the other scales, that people are not seeing you like that. People already lost this trait, and this is the most important message we need to do. We first of all need to humanize our message, understand, in order to maintain this. Before I continue, yes, we'll take first.
In both cases, the message is killing Jews are bad, do not kill Jews, Holocaust was bad. Only on one side, I hear about someone who I can resonate with because she also handled through hardship and actually spoke her coherent thoughts about that.
When I watched The Grave of the Fireflies, I knew in the status quo the Japanese did horrible and horrendous things to the Chinese people and to other people around. But when I saw in the movie, based upon a book, a 5-year-old child who died for no reason, it's just more easier to me to understand that not all Japanese people are creating these things. That means not all Israelis are making these things, and therefore not all Jews are making these horrible things. And let's weigh it up and grapple on basic things while we're winning this debate on three metrics. Metric number one, we're just creating the most connective message. On their side of the house, I'm sorry, but you have huge amount of anti-war and anti-protest message. That means when you're trying to, like, for example, to reduce some kind of pacifism, You see this in day-to-day movies. Like, I have millions of movies who are very good futable and very marketable, and people are filming him time after time, Save Private Ryan. It doesn't really, no, sorry, let me take another one. And so we believe that we have a lot of peace messages that already exist in the status quo. And the second reason, we're just creating we're creating the most reasonable and stable impact. We believe this impact on this debate just targeted the Jews. Because in the status quo this message targeted and talked about the Jews, this is just much more appealing. And we can see the active actions. The active actions when we see this thing is when the child goes first time to see someone Jew, he will try to, first of all, humanize him because he will understand, yeah, this little girl will suffer from the Holocaust. Yes, maybe she was, maybe the country of harassed Palestinians did things like that. She sees something like more humanistic. That means those children will not hate the person itself. They will not try to harm the people out of it. We believe this is crucial in the status quo because we see this huge amount of violence. We see how there are time and time again more and more anti-Semitic attacks that getting repurposed. And because of that, what we need to do in order to create this thing, we need to create the most important impact for the only character who can actively be targeted by this, the Jews. Because we're the only team that should show direct impact with this narrative against the minority groups who are actively targeted by this, we just call it to oppose.
And the cat ate the goat, and the goat bit the cat, and the dog ate the cat, and the stick hit the dog, and so on until the angel of death kills us all. This cycle of violence is the world that closing opposition is trying to make you support in this debate, and this is the world that we show you a way out of the way no one else does in this debate, by explaining how people will meaningfully engage with the content that they're reading in a way that impacts the policies they support and the way they behave on the day-to-day to people who are different than them or in their outgroup. Being the only team that does that, we will win by explaining why we get more meaningful exposure and why that's more important. I care more, I'm happy to have less exposure, but that's more meaningful and leads to actual change, rather than more exposure that's meaningless. Let's first of all take closing opposition out of this debate. First of all, if I show you that the global meaningful engagement that we get means that people are less likely to retaliate against others, including Jews, even if they're anti-Semitic and even if they hate them, the change is, given that I hate someone and fear them, how do I behave to them? It means that even if they stay anti-Semitic, they're still not going to take actions that are equally as harmful. So I don't need to prove to you that I solve anti-Semitism. I need to prove to you that I change how people are engaging with the way they behave towards people who they dislike. 2, they think that it's alienating because they think she's dumb. First of all, we think the way we've analyzed how people are going to meaningfully engage does not rely on agreeing with Etty's philosophy at the end of the day. Notice what Zvi explains to you about the way this is likely to be taught and how people are likely to engage. You're likely to be asked questions like, if you were a young Jew, a young German during this time, would you join the Hitler Youth? Ask questions like, would you cooperate with Nazis to save yourself? Ask questions like, is it possible to defeat violence and oppression through peace? These are the kinds of questions you're going to ask, especially in places that don't initially agree with this philosophy, like Victor wants. We think that that means that the way people are engaging isn't, oh, I'm engaging only with Etty's philosophy and this is what I'm teaching is right. No, I'm engaging with it in a way that makes me ask myself questions and ask what I think is right. Do I agree? Do I disagree? Do I agree in specific cases and not in others? This is exactly the way I'm going to engage with it. It's not dependent on me thinking that she was correct. 2, I do think that people who hate other people or think they're wrong for not being strong enough and standing up against them are the same people whose minds won't change about Jews no matter what, because they believe in a world of violence and oppression. It won't help to them to hear Anne Frank. If they fear you and they think you can harm them and they believe they have a reason because Jews control the banks, the way they're going to behave doesn't change because they read Anne Frank. They're still going to be convinced by that. That doesn't change. Lastly, I just think that this allows the liberals who support you around the world, who aren't anti-Semitic, to view Jews in actively a positive light because they see that there are good Jews that actually support things like pacifism and aren't mean. Let's go on to why we get more meaningful exposure. What do opening opposition tell us? They tell us the following things. They focus on the content of what is in there. They say it's relatable because it's simple, it's politically alienating, potentially on the alternative, and being a hero makes someone unrelatable. On the last, literally all fantasy series prove that she's wrong. Someone being a hero, someone I look up to, someone I want to be like, is someone I relate to because I want to see myself in the most positive light. And even if I don't see myself in them right now, I want to be like them. I idealize them. And notice that I'm not saying I'll idealize Etty and say that's a good way to behave. I'm saying that the process of questioning will lead them to reach conclusions about who exactly it is that they do want to be, and that will give them the ideals that they want to go up against. 2, while we might agree that people might relate, we disagree that this means that they're actually actively thinking about it for many reasons. 1, because it reads like an average diary. The only meaningful part of the Anne Frank diary is the context around it, is engaging with concentration camps, is engaging with why she was hiding in the attic in the first place, and the fact that people were doing the terrible things to people around that. That's what gives it its meaning. If I literally only read it like a little girl's diary, I have no idea why it's interesting to anyone. I, as a 13-year-old girl, didn't want to read other 13-year-old girls' diaries because fuck them, especially under 40s. What does that have anything to do with me, right? But 2, if I do engage with it, it's equally as political as what Etty is, in which case I don't understand their comparative. 2, simple content might be interesting, but I forget about that immediately. 2, I don't take little girls seriously. She's young, she's little, she doesn't know what she's talking about, she wasn't comprehending things. I don't think that I have anything to learn from her, and therefore I don't take her seriously and think about it. And lastly, even if all they say is correct, over-relating to someone who had a terrible, terrible life makes me not want to engage with the reasons why their life was terrible because it scares me and creates negative emotions towards myself. All this means that even if I relate more, the way I'm engaging with the content doesn't reach the conclusions or make me think about what it means in my life and how I want to behave. What do we give you about this? Tzvi says you have meaningful analysis of things. Opening opposition says it's alienating to kids. I say, I think it means to engage your brain. Initially, do I want to answer test questions about any subject? No, because I'm a child. But having done that, I don't immediately forget it, especially when I'm engaged in actual questions like, how does this apply to my life? That means that maybe I don't take it seriously in the moment, but even if it's stored in my brain and 3, 5, 10 years down the line, I encounter a situation where it's relevant, the information isn't gone, it's in my brain and I can relate to it, but only if I've engaged with it meaningfully enough to have it stick in my brain and I haven't memorized it so that I can just answer A, B, C, D. Go. Tzvi's analysis has nothing inherent or unique to the book. It is about how teachers choose
No,
to teach
it's not. It's your analysis. Lily, in her speech, said the way it's going to be taught is you have to explain what pacifism is before you talk about other things, right? This is their analysis, not Tzvi's. It's going to be engaged with differently because of that. Next, he talks about the emphasis on price. What do we get an answer to that? Einstein is utilitarian. Well, the way that people are going to engage with it will allow people to think about those utilitarian things. What I read without thinking about is the diary of a 13-year-old girl who I'm avoiding politicizing, so I'm not engaging with the rest of it. And lastly, men. I think Tzvi weighed this. I don't need to repeat it, but that's another thing that isn't answered and I think is just true. This is over-opening government for 2 reasons. Why? It's not why just the content is better, right? It's why it leads to actual utilization of that content in ways that change things in the world. And 2, we explain not why just better, but Anne Frank is an active harm to people's ability to consider that because of the way they dismiss the writing. What does this lead to in terms of meaningful education? 1, I think that when people imagine how they want to behave in these situations, that's exactly when they shout less provocative things in the street to people to upset them. This is when they think they should speak out against violence at the end of the day. This is when, even if it's difficult to hire someone other than you, they take that opportunity because they think it's the right thing to do. And this has that compounding effect. Because if 3 people do it, 10 people do it, and I see that it's popular, then I'm more likely to do it myself. For these reasons, please.
When the stick came for the dog, I did nothing, for I am not a dog. The stick, I still did nothing. And as the cycle continued, God sat there, waiting to be the last, watching his children ask, where is God? When we were supposed to intervene. The messages closing government give us are actively harmful to our ability to combat the evils of the world. We are going to do 2 very simple things here. Firstly, I am going to flip the narrative analysis using what Victor told you and explain to you why the narratives we get from both government teams actively endorse doing nothing. They tell us to stand on the side, and secondly, I'm going to explain why Victor and not opening actually gave you impacts to how we can change the world beyond just knowing the story. First, a tiny bit of framing that is critical for this round. Is the motion Israel, somewhere else? Lots of bizarre discussion on that. One thing is clear. The motion is much more likely to be about privileged kids for a couple of major reasons. Number one, they simply have better education. They are much more likely to learn things in school and actually remember it. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, they are also way more likely to have school trips to a museum. That is to say, even if there's something in your history textbook, these stories work. When you see them in a museum, when it's told in pictures, all of those things are way more likely for privileged kids. And thirdly, white guilt. If you have your own stories of trauma, you probably focus more on those in school, and those shape the way you see trauma anyway, whereas white people, rich white people, who need to understand what it's like because they have never been the victims, but are likely to victimize people if they don't understand these messages, they are the ones who learn most from this. Meaning, the most important thing that we can do with this information is take the people who could choose to join ICE, take the people who could choose to lock immigrants in cages, and make them realize what they are doing to children. Now, let's talk about how this interacts with governments. Not yet. So, opening government tell us that Etty Hillesum can be seen as a hero. And we agree. Just like superheroes. We agree. You know what my job is when Superman runs into a burning building to save a child? To stand on the side and do nothing because it is the hero's job. We recognize that you can look up to these people. We get no analysis on why you are likely to act in a way that helps anyone. And why is that so critical? Because Etty Hillesum, for all that she's a great story, is one of 6 million who didn't make it, who could have been saved and wasn't by all these rich white kids going to see the story. The kids will have the opportunity to do that next time. None of that was accomplished, and we think that is the crucial mistake we need to teach. Whereas Anne Frank is a scared child begging for someone to help her. She knows this is wrong, but is powerless on her own. That is a message that says it is our job as bystanders to make something happen. It is our job to intervene, to help the world. That is exactly the message we want.
PY.
Who did you not take? Closing? Go ahead.
Later.
I'll wait for them, and if not, I'll take them. So, let's be very clear on the issues with opening government. Opening government tells us they want it to be more factual. Other than not just impacting why factual really matters, there's a bigger problem. They need to read the motion. When exploring Holocaust victims, that is to say, there are still textbooks about the Holocaust itself. No one learns what the Holocaust is through the story of one girl, whether she was a nurse or hiding in an attic. They still go to the museum, they see the scope of the tragedy, they see the shoes, they see the photos of emaciated corpses piled up to the sky. Meaning, if you are getting Holocaust education, you know the Holocaust is terrible on either side. What you may not know is what you can do with that message, and that is where opening government crucially fail in this debate. They tell us, oh, we can draw conclusions of how she teaches anti-racism. We think that is a terrible message for the people who are unlikely to be dealing with racism, but much more likely to potentially be racists or to stand on the side when racism happens. We might admire her, but we don't empathize in a way that leads to any concrete action. Then they say, oh, but you're inspired. I'm inspired. The story gives me hope. Firstly, I can be inspired by Superman too. I can get hope from fiction stories. I think a lot of people turn to those because they can still give me that narrative. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, then what? I can have hope because I can know there are really good people in the world. A, I am probably not them, but B, even if we're charitable and accept what closing add, which is, oh, I want to be like them, we think being like them in these situations is the wrong thing to do. Meaning, even if, on our side of the debate, we prove to you literally nothing in terms of what the narrative is, we think it is better than an actively damaging narrative which tells people to stand on the side. Now they say, oh, but you need this in order to intervene. No, people have natural empathy for children. Anne Frank is a child and we feel bad. Just like a child in a cage is a child and we feel bad. Just like a child in a burning house is a child and we feel bad. However, our instinct to help is silenced when there are heroes there. When these people stand up strong and say, this is my duty and I will do this, it is my role to take this upon myself, we say, oh, then never mind. Then it's not my role to help. That is what is most damaging in this debate. Yes, closing.
Panel, we are the only team in the debate that proves likelihood about how these things are actually taught in class and how it ends the cycle of justified violence.
Okay, I don't think the likelihood on how this is taught is a major clash in this debate simply because The info slide tells you what the story is to the degree that children get the narrative, they get it. But we actually think that their narrative is harmful? No.
Last chance?
They tell us, no. They tell us we have this question of, well, how would you behave in this situation? Again, we think if no one asks you this story, you want to intervene. We think it is our education telling us it is their special narrative that tells us we don't have to. No, specifically for Jews in two ways. Firstly, the story of Etty Hillesum is a story of a Jew, once again, saying she is the chosen nation, she is above you, and she will handle it on her own. We think, A, this brings active anti-Semitism. It makes people feel like this nation does not want to be looked at as human beings. Specifically, the one opportunity we have to talk about Jews to people who aren't. We think when anti-Semitism is a real problem, we do not take advantage of our one shot to explain Jews are people too, and instead use it on, hey, look, Jews are morally superior to you. But secondly, we think it is the statement that this is somehow our destiny. We are okay with suffering. We are not. We have suffered, and we have suffered because no one came to help. We think we are the team that ends that in this debate. So when they tell us in closing, oh, but your behavior doesn't really change, there are two things. Firstly, yes, it changes because we see their people. Etty Hillesum is exactly the Jews telling a story of us being superior, whereas Anne Frank is a story of us telling how we are humans, how we need to be saved just like everyone else. But secondly, even if we don't, their narrative is actively harmful, meaning we are the only opposition team here to prove a positive delta where things are better in the world because of us. For all those reasons, closing opposition.